Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're incredibly excited to have you all here with us today. As you file into the room, tell us your name, find the chat, tell us your name, tell us where you're located, and tell us your role as you join us here. Um, Also, while you file in, I have some quick housekeeping to do, and then I will introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. So first thing to note is that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be sent out to everyone that is registered. With that recording, you'll get a copy of the slide deck as well as a certificate of attendance. We may reference a variety of resources today. If there are any links or downloadables that we do reference, that will come your way in about 24 hours after we wrap up our time together today. Next, there is a chat box, like I said, available to you in your Zoom window. Take a moment to find it. Again, let us know where you're from. We are an interactions company, so we want to interact with you. Send in those comments as we talk today. We have staff on hand ready to engage with you. If you have specific questions that you want answered, there is a Q&A function as well in Zoom. So use that for questions and then use the chat for sort of general comments. We will hold some questions for the end, but we will do our best to address as many of them as we can by the end of the webinar. All right, with that, I would like to quickly introduce today's panel, and then we will run into a poll. I'll start with Sarah. Sarah Schatt is our Impact Program Manager here at Teachstone. Thank you, Sarah, for your time and for your expertise today. And we're honored also to have Ross Harold with us, the Senior Director of the Early Childhood Assessment and Early Childhood Health Office at the New York City Department of Education. Thank you for spending time with us today, Ross. All right, we're going to get started with the poll. I will go ahead and launch it. And Sarah, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited for the opportunity to share with everyone more about the class environment. It's been a fun journey, and it's really great to be at the point where we can share it out and start talking more in detail about what we've been working on. So while everyone is taking a moment to answer the poll, just throwing your role in there, I will also just talk through the agenda once you've had a minute to do that. It's fun to see the answers come through too. And just
All right, I just pulled up the results, Sarah. Do you see them?
Great, yeah. So it looks like we have just a wide variety of participants. We've got educators, instructional leaders, site leaders, implementation leaders. We've got some observers and data collectors, and then folks who do things outside of our categories, which is awesome. So today we're going to spend our time just doing a brief overview of kind of why class environment, what this is all about. We'll talk a little bit about how we came to develop the class environment, and then go through a brief overview of what the instrument looks like at the infant, toddler, and pre-K level, and then also just what it means to use the class environment with the class. We'll touch a little bit on class environment as part of our continuous quality improvement process, how we use class environment on the improvement side, and what it looks like in action. And for that last piece, we'll turn the floor over to Ross, who has had the opportunity to work with the class environment through its very, very early days up to present, and has a lot of insights about the way in which New York City has been able to use the class environment. So I'm sure, the big question, just to start off, that I imagine that a lot of you have is, we're the interactions company here. We know that interactions are the most powerful driver of children's outcomes. So why class environment? Why are we talking about the environment now? And there's a number of answers to that question. And I think the class environment was really born out of the question of how can we better support high quality interactions in learning settings. And so, one of the goals was to think about how we can help educators and administrators and policymakers envision their environments and arrange their environments in ways that better support those kinds of high quality interactions. And then on the other side, it's just part of, company-wide process of trying to think really much more holistically about how we support child outcomes. That while we know that interactions are at the heart of children's learning, that we also know that there are other things that affect teachers' ability to engage in really effective interactions. We know that a teacher, sitting in a cardboard box in the dark with 40 children faces a very different reality. Just to have a really extreme example from a teacher who is, or an educator who is in a learning space that is equipped with really interesting didactic materials, lots of space, opportunities, for children to engage in different modalities and materials. And so recognizing that, that exists, and if we can think about it in a more systematic way and use that information to support teachers and the ways they interact with kids, then that's to the benefit of everyone in the field. So just, writ large, again, the kind of in broad strokes, we can summarize our why in a couple of ways. And I think one of them is that, we know that if we collect information about the environment, and especially information about the environment that we can utilize to support teachers in their interactions, we can maximize, the information that we're getting out of a classroom that can be used to drive improvement, for not only for teachers, but for coaches and other stakeholders. This is also an opportunity to streamline data collection, reporting, and sharing by just using one tool, or at least under one system. And kind of along those same lines, there's a real opportunity because we're in classrooms and learning spaces throughout the country every single day collecting class observation data. And this is an opportunity to reduce time and investment costs associated with additional quality observations by just being able to have a one-stop shop to be able to collect a lot of rich data around interactions, and then also things like the environment that supports those interactions in one observation period. The class environment is collected at the same time as class. So it's an opportunity to really bring this information at scale in a feasible and cost-effective way to the field. And then finally, it's just one more as kind of, part of that holistic approach. It's one more opportunity to focus on elements in the learning space that can potentially impact the ways in which teachers are able to interact with children and ultimately children's learning and development. So we have a short video clip here that I think does a nice job of framing the class environment. You'll notice that in this video, we refer to the class environment as the class environmental scales, which was a name we used at the beginning of our kind of piloting process before we settled on the final name. So you can just discard that part. We're talking here about the class environment.
What is the classroom environment and why focus on it? The Classroom Assessment Scoring System, or the CLASS, is a powerful tool that assesses the quality of teacher-child interactions and is shown through rigorous research that effective interactions with every child are the strongest predictor of children's learning and development. But interactions are supported by the environments in which they occur. The classroom environment refers to the arrangements, displays, and materials within the spaces where children learn. The class environmental scales will help you to focus, measure, and improve these specific features of the classroom environment so that they can enhance teacher-child interactions and children's learning and development for every child.
Great. So I would actually love to hear from you, and you can either just reflect on this on your own, or throw up a quick message in the chat for everyone else to reflect on together. Of if you think about how a material or a display or some feature of the classroom environment or the learning setting has helped you engage with a child. And I'll just, to give you an example, and this is not out of a classroom, but I just think about, one thing that we did differently in my home when we moved a couple of months ago was we took all of the kids' silverware and they're like endless amounts of, things to drink water out of, the bottles, the cups, the this, that, and we just put them all in a really low drawer so that they could just go get their things instead of asking me 300,000 times, before 8 o'clock in the morning, like for water or milk or the other thing. And so that was an opportunity kind of within the class lens to think about how to support regard for children's perspectives and how to support their autonomy and their, sense of responsibility within the house was, putting all of our stuff low down so that they could access it on their own. That would be my example as you guys are also kind of reflecting on this. I see some answers coming into the chat, and I'm really excited to also just come back and take a look at these. So I hear, predictability of where materials are so that there are clearly defined spaces where children know, that where things are in the classroom, that they have access to sensory materials, to materials that are really engaging to all of their senses, so that they can, engage more fully. Open-ended materials. I imagine, open-ended materials are great opportunities for extended conversations, for questions about why and how, for planning. Thank you. These are really great. Just one other one about, the placement of the arrangements within the room to affect visibility so that teachers can be aware of where kids are and respond to them. Yeah, these are all fantastic ways in which the environment can really affect the way that educators interact with children. So just to move a little bit more into like, okay, so, great. We've talked in very broad terms about the class environment and where it came from and the framework and that it's centered in. But what actually are we talking about? So the classroom environment has about 30 items. And the items reflect features of the classroom that support higher quality interactions. We focus on room arrangements, materials, and displays is kind of the framework that we look at within the classroom to categorize different features of the environment. And each item is scored on a 3-point scale. I'll also say, just in addition to this list, the class environment was developed, very explicitly also to support educators and class coaches and observers and administrators to better understand how a learning setting can impact, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to make sure that we made clear how specific improvements could cultivate the most effective environments to benefit all children. And so even though a number of our items are kind of, written generally, it's important to just call out here that, a number of the items were specifically developed to support, children who are language learners, all of our diverse populations of children, as well as children with, different learning styles, special needs, or disabilities. So our class scale, I mentioned that it's a 3-point scale for the class environment. In general, we score a 1 if the observer doesn't see evidence of the item. So they come into a classroom and they don't see any displays at child eye level. It would be a 1. Or they come into the classroom and they don't see any open-ended materials. That item would be a 1. A 2 is when an observer sees some or very few instances of an item. And then a 3 is when an observer sees many instances of an item. And you'll notice here from this scale that, you know, this is very different from maybe other environmental measures that you might be familiar with. This, you know, our goal here, kind of in the context of supporting interactions and supporting teachers in this ongoing improvement process, is not to create an incredibly, you know, rigorous, we're getting down on our knees and measuring how many, you know, inches of mulch are in, you know, in the outside play area kind of instrument, but rather to give us a sense, you know, a really broad sense in the classroom of the ways in which the classroom or the learning environment is able to support effective interactions, or where there are opportunities for improvement to support those effective interactions. So I'll just give you a second to look at this next image, and you can, again, if you want to engage in the chat, just if there's anything that you observe about this learning setting, knowing that, you know, no one here has had a chance to take a deep dive into the class environment, so we're not expecting you to pick up, you know, specific items, but just, you know, to think about and react to what you see in this environment and how you might use it with children. And I can also just narrow down that observation a little bit to say, you know, if you're looking at, for example, you know, whether children walking into the space know how to direct their time and attention, are there in general clearly defined areas, what your reactions to that question would be. I'm seeing a lot of really great responses come in. So we see that spaces are clearly defined. It's very clear that children, you know, when they walk into this setting without needing a tremendous amount of guidance or instruction or facilitation, you know, have a sense of how they can use these different spaces. You know, when we think about instructional learning formats and, you know, engaging children's time and attention and having clear objectives, you know, this kind of a learning space would probably help teachers to meet that goal with children. We see low shelves, accessible materials. Someone also mentioned that, you know, that there's not a tremendous amount of materials. This is, again, as we looked kind of through the lens of COVID, we're frequently in classrooms where there are adjustments made in terms of like the amount of materials that are out at a time. But that's a good observation as well. All right, thank you. And then this next one, again, I know you're looking at just like a very little narrow slice of a classroom, so it's hard to talk about what it is you see here, but this next image is an example that we can, so just back to the first one, the image that we just looked at would be an example of a high level of purposeful spaces, which is one of our items, which again, just kind of talks about you know, whether the room is arranged so that children know how to direct their time and attention. And we house that in the classroom organization domain, thinking about ways in which it could potentially support our instructional learning formats. This item here, would also just love to, you know, have some quick reflections about in the frame of materials for imaginary or creative play. If this was all you saw in a classroom, how that, you know, might support or might hinder your ability to engage in interactions with children around imaginary or dramatic play. Yeah, and then see that, you know, there's not that much here. So you have pretty limited options for children. There's very little, it looks like, you know, that they might be broken or not entirely complete. They're, you know, the toys are not, someone mentioned that they're not, you know, all together in one area, they're not on the shelf, they're on the floor. These are great comments. This would be an example on the lower end of materials for dramatic or imaginary play. So if we saw some, you know, very limited, but some materials, we would score a classroom in the mid-range because there's something. But again, we think about, you know, the ways in which caregivers can interact and educators can interact, you know, in extended conversations to support children's language and creativity. if children have very limited opportunities, to engage with creative or dramatic play materials, educators might have a more difficult time doing those things. I see some raised hands. We'll have a moment for questions in just after a couple more slides. So please make sure to hang on to those, and Gloria will facilitate some questions at the end of the session. So here, I know the type here is a little small, so everyone's probably right up against the computer trying to see what we're looking at. But this is just an example to give you a specific example of what an item might look like on the infant toddler class environment. Items on the infant toddler class environment are grouped into the toddler domains of emotional behavioral support and then engaged support for learning. Though also, being sensitive to the needs of infants as well. And so this item is sightlines, and the definition is that, arrangements allow educators to position themselves for clear sightlines to observe children's cues, whether those are verbal or nonverbal, from all areas of a child care setting. And we have a description of a low, a mid, and a high range score. And then you'll see we have some notes and some considerations. So we understand that, especially in FCCs, or that, in some care settings, it's really, that there are things that are outside of teachers' control in terms of whether there's like an L-shaped room or, a giant post in the middle of the room. And so we would just want to see the use of things like mirrors or monitors so that teachers have the opportunity to see children, even if they can't physically position themselves to be able to do so. And again, this item is housed in emotional behavioral support, and kind of in the sense that, within the lens of teacher sensitivity, that educators are much more able to, not only notice, be conscious of, but also respond comprehensively and quickly to children's needs if they can see them. And especially for our learners who, might not be, shouting for the teacher every time they need help, but might need teachers to be more in tune with their nonverbal cues, whether it's because they don't feel comfortable asking for help in the language of instruction, or because maybe they just don't know how to ask for help. And then finally, at the very bottom, use it back. Finally, at the very bottom, we have a little justification, just so that users understand the why. So all right, so why is this item important? And it says, when educators can easily observe all children from all areas of the childcare setting, they can more easily notice children's verbal and nonverbal cues and be aware of children's needs, which enables them to respond appropriately and promptly. And so we just talked about that, but I just wanted to point out that it's right there in the item table as well, because we wanted to make really explicit the link between these items and the kinds of things that they support, the interactions that they support in a classroom. We can move on to, and so here we have the another item on the pre-K version of the class environment. And this item is space for child privacy. And the definition is, children have access to a space for individual play, learning, silence, or calming time. And then private spaces are somewhat physically separated from busier, noisier parts of the setting. You'll see again, we have a description of a 1, 2, and 3, some notes, and then a justification. And our justification says that all children occasionally need privacy to work or play alone, concentrate, or collect and refresh themselves before rejoining the group. Caregivers can more easily respond to this need by offering a space where children can have privacy while still feeling safe and being seen by an adult. This is particularly important for children acquiring a new language, as this can provide a language shelter, which is a place that is quieter, where they do not have to produce or directly hear any language. Great. So just to kind of, to give you a sense of how this might, work with class and how this might help support teachers. We envision that educators use the class environment alongside class. to provide really specific and comprehensive feedback to teachers, to educators, administrators. And so, for example, educators who are working to grow professionally in the domain of instructional support might look at corresponding environment item scores in that domain and consider, for example, how the presence of open-ended materials, which is one of our items, could enhance their ability to engage in effective interactions around concept development, analysis and reasoning, how and why questions. And with that question, educators could explore how to use open-ended materials to support, for example, facilitating creative activities with children. I think another example is, educators working to grow their skills in the pre-K class domain of productivity might look to class environment items up around, how they could improve their communication of expectations for routines or transitions to help children follow through on those tasks and self-regulate. So, for example, in reviewing their environmental items, educators might notice that materials like turn-taking pegs, physical materials in the environment and lines on the floor, to get ready to leave or to sit without with their bodies not sitting on top of their friends' bodies, could improve the ways in which teachers can support their interactions in behavior management or in productivity with children. And then this example is a nice one too. Some of you who have done a lot of class training might recognize this teacher and child from some of our exemplar videos. But a child comes into the classroom really upset because she misses her mother, and the teacher is able to respond in a really sensitive and warm way, and also draw on materials from her environment to help the child feel better. So they use some socio-emotional learning materials. They look at a feelings chart. The teacher is able to help the child verbalize that she feels sad by using those materials. They're able to talk through that, and then they go and use some art materials when the teacher and child decide that they're going to make a card for the child's mother, which for the child is a resolution, and she stops crying, and the teacher is able to successfully move her through a problem and find a resolution. And aided by those materials that she had, whether it was the socio-emotional learning materials or the art materials to make the card. So those are just a couple examples of how the class environment and the class work together. But now we'll turn the microphone over to Ross, who is going to talk to us about the experience of New York City of actually using the class environment and the ways in which it's been useful for them.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And it's been nice to read the questions that are very much questions that I'm seeing here that we considered when we were piloting this tool, as well as in our early steps that we have taken to start using it this year. For context, in New York City, to understand program quality, we use both the class as well as the ECHRs and the FECRs. To some extent, we use the ITERs, but not necessarily as deeply and as we go forward. So what we really saw as the value of class, as you all know, is the interactions and the space to really have common language and understanding with our program staff. And the ECHRs has a ton of value in that it's a deep dive into soups and nuts of a classroom. One of our challenges we experience with the ECHRs is when we visit a site, we only visit one classroom, whereas with the class, the way our model works is we visit all classrooms on site. So we wanted to have a way to understand what was going on in the physical environment, as well as the interactions that were going on inside of the classroom. So we were interested in kind of thinking ourselves, we were going to develop something that looked at the physical space while you're there for a class observation. And as somebody who was first trained as a class evaluator, I can say that I was less attuned to things like water turning on at sinks when I was doing just my class observations. Then once I became ECHRS trained, I immediately would be doing a class and then turn my head to have an eye on what was going on over there. So our team really recognized that we were missing out on opportunities to see what was in the environment. So when we learned that Teachstone was piloting the environmental scales, we jumped at the opportunity to work and collaborate with them in a thoughtful way to really identify what could be going on in the environment in the classroom and see if a way we can strategically see more classrooms and the environment and what was going on. And we saw it as a really good partner with the Eckers because it was a way for us to quickly look. And I saw somebody in the chat was mentioning that it could be a good entry point for somebody who may be newer to a classroom. The scale is less in depth and intensive. To Sarah's earlier point, you're not taking a tape measure out to the playground and measuring the depth of the mulch. Instead, you're getting a sense of what's going on in the classroom, and it's by no means meant to be. We're not using it to like understand incredible depth, but we also are using it in conversation with the Eckers where maybe there are some things that we notice from the class environmental scales that may say, hey, it would benefit us to do an Eckers observation in this space to really give some more robust feedback on some specific pieces of what's going on in the classroom. So our team of evaluators were trained on the environmental scales, so they were already class reliable. And I apologize, I'm using the wrong lingo now. I hadn't realized until Sarah said it. So the class environmental, so our staff was trained on that. And essentially the difference that kind of happens is our evaluators will get there for class, much like we used to do for Eckers, a little bit early to introduce ourselves, but also just poke around the classroom to look at materials in the general space. There's a certain amount of questions that you really kind of need to see how the interplay goes on inside the classroom in terms of like how materials are used, what line of sight looks like, and things like that. But generally, you get a sense of like most of a good chunk of the stuff you can check in on, like when you're looking at displays, like we were just looking at the pictures together beforehand. When I've talked with my evaluators who go do the observations using the tool, and when I myself have used it, it essentially is the equivalent of like a little less than one more cycle that you're doing in order to collect the data for class. And so those of you all familiar with the class, it's a 20-minute cycle. Usually it's less than 20 minutes to gather the data that is for the environmental scale. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of talk through what is going on there. So I will flag what the class environmental scale is not that the Eckers is. The class environmental scale does not look really discretely at health practices. So it doesn't look necessarily at things like, are we washing our hands before our meal? Instead, it's looking a lot more at like the play and what's going on. There was a deliberate decision there, from what I understand, to that most everybody who is providing childcare has the Department of Health visiting, kind of attending to those key factors. So that's why it's not part of the environmental scale. We ourselves in New York just kind of adapted and like took a few key items that we thought were important, and also approached it from a higher level, much like the environmental scales are, where we said, you know, before they went to a meal, did they try to wash their hands? Yeah. Or like, was there attempts made at appropriate times and had a general sense, but we weren't doing the time or anything like that. So yeah, we really use the two tools in conversation, but we use class much more broadly in the environmental scales. And it's already been a really helpful place for us to provide feedback to teachers about general practices that they could improve. And by no means is it the depth, because you're not spending 3 hours in one classroom no matter what is happening. But it's a quick way for us to get a sense of what's going on and give teachers some feedback, because one of the experiences we would have is we would, you know, write our reports, and there'd be some things where like an evaluator would say, your real gap here was how you set up, you know, whatever, that there weren't enough materials and children like that. There wasn't necessarily the most clear space to like call that out within class reports in a standard way, but it has created an opportunity for us to open those conversations where there really are connections between the classroom environment and those important interactions. So I'm going to do a quick look at the questions to see if I hit most of them. I will, Sarah may have more on this first question about reliability ratings. The focus is less on like a perfectly exact score and more about how you can like use the data and information to provide helpful feedback and guidance. Having a 3-point scale kind of gives you a range, and it's pretty clear what's kind of going on. So we have been using it less like, for the class itself, we want to make sure we're precise and scoring reliably and accurately and very precisely. The environmental scales, we are having similar conversations. And I will say also in-house, we started having more conversations about like, what does this mean? Is this laid out this way, or whatever else is going on? But we are less focused on getting the exact like definition of what the nuance between a 2 or 3 may be in certain scenarios, but generally like going in that direction. And I would say there are some items that hit on appropriate amount of materials in spaces, whether it's too much or too little within it. And you can kind of see that within the tool as well. I think one thing that we have liked seeing was the focus on displays in a few different ways. That was helpful for us within our class observations as well. And I think I've kind of hit all of them. I don't know, Sarah, if you have, or if any other folks have questions. What do you want me to do next?
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, I think we will come back through and go through all the questions shortly. So that was really helpful. So just one kind of final piece about the kind of the nuts and bolts of the class environment is that the training itself will be offered along with all class trainings. It's an asynchronous online training, which means that learners do it on their own. And it's only about 4 hours. It's meant to only take a half a day. So it's supposed to be a fairly easy ask to add on to, the amount of time that we already invest in a class training. And then there will be a couple of pathways. So there's a pathway for observers. There is a pathway for teachers who are using this in the context of professional development. And then also there'll be supports for coaching, so the coaches have a really clear sense of how they can use this with class to help support teachers as they're on their professional development journey. So just in closing, and as part of our focus to, first focus, identify, observe, measure, and then be able to improve, that the class environment is just one more supplement to our toolkit to be able to better support the ways in which teachers interact with children and ultimately children's learning and development.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ross, for all that information. We do have more questions, it looks like, that are coming in, so we're going to spend a few moments answering some questions. I'll get us started with COVID. We've had a couple of questions come in about how the new class environment has sort of adjusted to that. With COVID guidelines and limitations, how does that affect the environment, and how does class environment factor that in?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question. And as we all know, COVID has affected every part of our life in the classroom and out. We know that classrooms, the ways in which children use materials, shared materials, kind of barriers between desks are ways in which the environment itself has shifted throughout COVID. Our items haven't changed or adjusted to take into account COVID, because really the items are developed out of, the ways in which they can better support teacher-child interactions, those kind of research backed interactions that support children's learning and development. And so although, whether what's happening in a classroom due to COVID is affecting children positively or negatively, we want to pick that up. And so the class environment doesn't have like special considerations for COVID, but rather just registers what, was happening in the environment, what is able to be observed.
The next question is, can you please talk about the appropriate amount of materials in the classroom environment? What is too little and what is too much?
That's a great question. So we only have one item that deals with quantity of materials, and it's an interesting item because it's actually one of the very few that is aided by being able to actually see children in the classroom. And our item looks at whether there's enough materials in the classroom so that all children can be engaged with a material. So the children are able to be redirected or engaged with the material. So it doesn't mean that like a classroom of 17 children needs to have 17 dolls, but that we're not seeing children having to wait large periods of time without opportunities to be redirected to other materials to be able to access a material. So I think in classrooms, to just look at the counter, in classrooms where there is such a scarcity of materials that children have to wait periods of time without any material to access, then those would score at the lower end. And as long as children are able to engage in some way with their environment and the materials there, then classrooms generally score at the high end.
A sort of similar question, and Ross, maybe you can chime in here as well. What if a center cannot afford a lot of materials? What does that look like? And can they be assured that, they won't see lower scores?
Can I start with this one and I'll pass to Dr. Ross, but just I love this question so much and I'm really happy you asked it. So thank you, because it's an incredibly important one. And it's one that we really took into account as we were developing the items. You'll see that a lot of the items are very low cost or no cost materials. So things like recycled materials, household items that have been introduced into the classroom, materials from nature, sticks, rocks, leaves, moss. And so we've made a real attempt to make sure that it's very clear that we do not expect teachers to go out to Target or to buy things from Lakeshore Learning to populate their environment, but really that that interesting didactic materials don't have to be expensive and they're incredibly accessible as long as teachers are willing to be a little creative about what they use in their classroom.
I'll just co-sign that as well. I think there's the only time I'm really thinking is like, I'm glad you elevated the nature's material, but also recycled materials as a specific item on here that really, that's the only thing I can think of where it's like particular, you're like, okay, but that is recycled. So by its nature, you're not having to go buy something. So there's no, it's less like the Eckers where you're counting and making sure this amount of X and this amount of Y are there. It's more about generally like how you've made things work in a variety of spaces. So.
Yeah, that said, I mean, just to be entirely honest, like if a classroom has no materials, they will not score very well. And that's not, a judgment on the teacher. It's just, the way in which the classroom environment is recognizing that a teacher that has absolutely no materials, no recycled materials, no found materials from nature, no household items that she or children or he or children have brought in, is going to just have a more challenging time engaging children in those effective interactions. Just to be, very balanced in the ways in which we talk about the class environment, that we've tried to make a tremendous effort to make the materials as low cost and accessible as possible. That said, it's an environmental measure and it does take into account, what is in the environment and what isn't. And I think that, especially coming, kind of coming from a place of great focus on interactions, that is a frustration with environmental measures that is just worth recognizing. There can be some tension there.
A couple sort of technical questions about the tool. How many elements are on the class environment, and is it only for pre-K or does that include infant and toddler?
Yeah, there's a pre-K version which has 29 items, and then there's a infant toddler version which has 32 items.
Thank you. And then we've gotten quite a few questions on when the trainings start for class environment. The date for that is August 1st. And then how do you sign up for the trainings? Our colleague Megan will put that in the chat. If you go to teachstone.com/class-environments, you'll also find all of that information there. I just wanted to call that out because we have seen that quite a few times. Another question that's come in, this seems easier for new teachers to grasp, and Ross, you talked about this a little bit. What is the experience like with sharing class environment feedback with teachers? And can I share this with new teachers who might not be familiar with learning environments?
Do you want to field that, Ross?
Sure. Yeah, I think like one thing that's particularly supportive is that I'm looking currently over at my environmental scale, which sits next to my Albert Eckers book, is that it's significantly thinner. And when you read it, it's much more accessible. It's like pretty quick for you to understand like some of the key elements that you want to be able to like see and understand from there. So in our experience, most of our debriefs have been with, sorry, everybody can hear me, right? Okay. Most of our debriefs have been with program leaders and the tool is new to them. So we sort of speak about it at like higher levels with less diving into the tool. But in our experience of talking with our coaches who are new with the resource as well, they are pretty quick to pick up on it and appreciate that it gives some specific examples while also like using easy to access language as we've kind of gone through it. Pass it to you, Sarah, if you have additional thoughts there too.
No, I think that's great. There.
All right. Well, that is all the questions that we've gotten in today. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ross, for your time today. Before everyone goes, final reminder that if you do want more information about this new tool, visit the webpage, teachstone.com/class-environments. And then there's also a form that my colleague is going to put in the chat as well if you do want to connect with us to talk about how you can implement this into your programs as well. So thank you all again, and again, thank you, Ross and Sarah. We'll see you all next time.
Thank you.